All right, well, thanks for joining us today and welcome to our question and answer session today. This is the Learn to Hunt program, and we have today Randy Smith. Randy is the Wetland Wildlife Program Manager for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and we're going to ask him a few questions that you guys have submitted. First of all, my name is Dan Stevens.
And I'm Jason Buckley.
So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll quickly introduce Randy and have him tell us a little bit about his background and a little bit about what his program and what his position entails within the DNR.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me today, guys. I am the Wetland Wildlife Program Manager for DNR. An alternative title to that could be State Waterfowl Biologist. But the program that I oversee is more diverse than just waterfowl. That's kind of the focus, but we're really concerned about all wetland wildlife and wetland habitat as well. So I guess just the program focus, or the kind of the main responsibilities anyway. Probably the biggest one is waterfowl hunting regulations, both at a statewide scale in terms of season dates and zone lines and things like that, and then also specific regulations at our state hunting areas and whatnot. So those are kind of dictated by administrative rules, and I oversee the waterfowl hunting ad rules. So that's a big part of it. I'm the technical representative to the Mississippi Flyway Council. That's the go-between between states and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for establishing waterfowl hunting regulations. I'm in charge of statewide wetland conservation planning and management through the Wildlife Action Plan. I serve on the State Duck Stamp Committee, and so that is the duck stamps that hunters purchase. Those funds are broken up, and we have to decide how those are spent. So they're hunter-generated funds, and there's a small committee that decides on how those are used. I also oversee research and monitoring projects with universities and other entities. My program includes two other biologists that I oversee. One is our waterfowl project manager, and one is our urban waterfowl project manager. And so they're in charge of things like all the bird banding in the state, and not all the bird banding the DNR does anyway, and waterfowl aerial surveys and nuisance goose and other migratory bird pit permitting and stuff. So we got a lot going on. Pretty busy program.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that quick introduction, and we'll go ahead and jump right into the questions. And this first question is kind of brings in a little bit more of the research aspect of things. So Joey asks, since it's been roughly 20 years since the snow goose conservation order was mandated, has this had any meaningful impact on reducing the population?
Sure, and that's a good question. Unfortunately, the answer is not really. I think I'll use the term feds loosely, but I'm referring to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service. I think they estimate about a 1% decline in that population annually. And that's really not enough to make the kind of changes that I think folks were hoping for through the conservation order. What we've come to realize is that the population is really strongly driven by adults and adult survival, and hunters largely harvest primarily juvenile birds. So in years when breeding is kind of a bust in the Arctic, on the tundra, hunter success declines pretty substantially. We're just really not putting a dent in those adults. They're long-lived birds. They're really smart. They're hard to hunt, even with electronic collars and unplugged shotguns and massive decoy spreads and all the things that go along with conservation order hunting. Yeah, it's a great opportunity, but really not having a huge impact on the snow goose population.
Sure. I have one follow-up question. You mentioned that most hunters are harvesting basically juvenile birds. And do you think that's due to the way that people are hunting, especially since, snow goose, it's typical to require, hundreds or even thousands of decoys in some cases. So do you think that just has the propensity to trick juvenile birds more readily, or do you think there's something else at play there?
Yeah, certainly they're certainly more naive to decoys and calls and things like that. And they also tend to migrate a little bit later. The adults tend to move through really quickly in the spring. They're pushing hard to get as far north as they can, as soon as they can, to set up, to establish their breeding territories and things like that. The juveniles are not going to breed in that first year, so they can linger a little bit more. And so they, if they're mixed in with adult flocks, they're going to be harder to pull out individually. But when you have flocks that are more entirely juveniles or subadults, maybe 2-year-old birds, something like that, those are the birds that are going to be more susceptible. I'm certainly not saying that we don't harvest adult snow geese. We absolutely do, thousands of them, but not at near the proportion that we do juveniles, or at a high enough level to really bring the population down.
Sure, interesting.
Okay, our next question is going to be from Ricky. And he was wondering kind of the regulatory process that you guys go through and how you use open house and public opinion on figuring out how to change your regulations, or maybe just go on with the regulation process after you guys
Sure.
get some public opinion on the new regulations that you guys come out with.
Sure, and I think this needs a little bit of pre-explanation to folks that aren't maybe really dialed in on how we set our regulations and whatnot in the state. So unlike a lot of our other hunted species, so say deer, turkeys, upland game, migratory birds, and waterfowl in particular, regulations are established through a cooperative process with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife management agencies. This is done through the Flyway Council, so Illinois is part of the Mississippi Flyway Council. So the Fish and Wildlife Service kind of dictates the outside frameworks, or really kind of the bookends within which states have to set their regulations. So for instance, we use 4 zones in Illinois. There's interest in using a split in the middle of our waterfowl season, but we can't use a split with 4 zones. That's part of the federal frameworks. In order to use a split, we'd have to drop to 3 zones. Just as kind of one thing. They also set, the maximum number of days, the bag limits for each species, those sorts of things. We have no control over those items. Those are federal regulations, and we have to abide by them. So to determine some of the other regulations, like the number of zones that we're going to use in the state, or specifically where those zone lines are going to occur within the state, those regulations have to be set for 5-year periods. That's another one of the federal framework requirements. So when the timing for that comes up, we go through a really extensive process that includes looking at waterfowl abundance based on aerial surveys, looking at freeze dates, looking at hunter's harvest from the federal parts collection survey. We look at, and then we do a lot of hunter opinion collection through annual mailed surveys that are administered by the Illinois Natural History Survey. And then we also do public open houses that are scattered around the state, and then also take emailed comments. So each of those things, from the biological side to the hunter opinion side, are one piece of information. No one thing really trumps anything else. So the open houses are a really important way to gauge kind of a more local interest on these different changes, but it is not simply a vote per se. So this last go around, we had a couple of proposed changes on the table. What we were really looking for with the open houses and having them in areas that would be impacted by those changes was really, I don't want to say overwhelming, but really strong and broad support for those changes. And what we found instead was really kind of moderate support for those changes. So, if results came back that 80% of hunters were in favor or were opposed to something, that would provide a really clear signal on what we need to do. But what we saw with a lot of the things that we talked about was like 40% of hunters were in favor of something, but 30-some% were also opposed to it. That's really a pretty even split. That's not an elect this thing over this thing. That's you're almost dissatisfying as many people as you're satisfying with that change. And so that's a really hard thing for us to endorse when all of kind of the other metrics that we look at are kind of on the fence as well. If we don't have something to really swing it hard in one direction, we end up kind of erring on the side of caution and going with the status quo usually is our recommendation. Those things haven't been officially decided yet. That was the recommendation from the Wildlife Division anyway.
Excellent. We'll move on to our next question from Jen. Jen asks, waterfowl hunting in Illinois is difficult. Is there any chance to open more access or opportunity for waterfowl hunting in the state?
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree. I grew up in Wisconsin, where there are, thousands of lakes that all have public access. You could duck hunt virtually all of them, or waterfowl hunt in general. So the move to Illinois was really an eye-opener for me, and really a steep learning curve in trying to navigate the relatively complex regulations that we have here. And so, yeah, this is a major goal of mine, is to expand hunting opportunity. We're doing a variety of things, but looking at sites as we look at potentially acquiring sites, or just even talking about existing sites that might not have waterfowl hunting now, but it might be appropriate for them. And in a lot of cases, this isn't going to be a real big hundreds of hunters a day type of program. It's going to be, maybe one or two groups of hunters a week, either through, managed through our permit system or something similar to that. But I think we've added 5 or 6 sites in the last handful of years, and some of those are in places where there's really not any other opportunity nearby. And so, those are significant but incremental changes, but those small changes are certainly better than none at all. And that's absolutely something that I'm constantly trying to work on, is trying to figure out ways to put more waterfowl hunters on the landscape here.
Okay, this is along the same lines as maybe an opportunity to do that would be Brett's question, which is, has Illinois DNR looked to expand waterfowl hunting opportunities by opening field hunting at public sites?
Yeah, this is, again, something that we've really just kind of started to look at recently, I would say. As I travel around the state and visit our different sites and visit with different site managers, site superintendents, and our district biologists, we have a lot of agricultural ground on our DNR properties, and I don't think that we are using that acreage as maybe as effectively as we could. I think at a lot of those sites, there's an opportunity to provide field hunting, or at least allow it. I think at some sites it would be really popular and there'd be a high demand for it. At other sites, just providing the opportunity, and and maybe it only provides 1 or 2 groups a couple of chances a year, on the off chance that some geese or some mallards are using those fields. But absolutely, that's something that we are actively working on as well. Changes like that, especially at sites that don't already have waterfowl hunting, that's a little bit of a long process. We have to move those things through the administrative rule process, and even under a best case scenario, that's usually a year from start to finish. And then site-specific changes we don't make every year. We usually do that on an every other year schedule. So even when we identify a site that we want to open to field hunting, it might be 2 years before we actually see hunters on the ground there. But again, incremental changes, but we're trying to increase access for sure.
Great. Now we'll kind of transition from the land access and kind of opportunity more to kind of the ecology side of waterfowl. So this question comes from Monica. Monica asks, there has been a theory circulating that the American black duck is essentially being hybridized out of existence, with the genes being lost in mallard hybrids. Is there any truth to this? And if so, what strategies are being used to address this?
Sure, and that's a great question as well. And there absolutely is some evidence that mallards and black ducks are hybridizing at a I guess I'll say a higher rate. Kind of luckily, there has just been some really good recent research that's come out, two papers in particular, that took a broad scale look at mallard and black duck hybridization. And Ducks Unlimited actually put together a really nice summary of these two papers with interviews with the authors and whatnot. We can probably provide a link to that, I would guess, in the comments. It's a really good summary. But I would say the gist of it is that in looking at black ducks kind of across their range, they still have really good genetic separation from mallards. There is certainly some genetic overlap in some areas, indicating that mallards have done some hybridization with them. But in general, the black ducks are for the most part still separate from mallards. Kind of the interesting flip side of this is that they looked at two different genetic signatures of mallards. They looked at kind of a game farm strain of mallards, and then also what we consider true wild mallards. And that game farm strain, which is largely from releases of mallards over the years, and in some places those are state-sponsored releases where they release thousands or hundreds of thousands of mallards a year. Those game farm genes are starting to creep more and more into the wild mallard genetics, there's probably some changes in physiological traits. There's probably some changes in behavior. There's probably, that could be changes in migration patterns, migration timing, propensity to nest or to stage in and around people. I mean, those game farm strains, even if they claim to be from wild strains, are typically not somewhere in their lineage. They're usually from European birds, and they're just very different. And they're starting to see those genes creep further and further westward. There's a study that's about to kick off in the Great Lakes region that there's going to be a genetic component of it to see if those game farm strains are starting to become more common in Great Lakes mallards. I don't know what it would take for those to get fully integrated into prairie mallards. I think there's enough prairie mallards that they could maybe swamp those out, but over decades or centuries that could change. The takeaway is that those game farm releases were all done with great intentions and to provide hunter opportunity, but the consequences of those actions are now just starting to maybe be realized, and we need to be really careful when we're doing releases and things like that. And I certainly wouldn't advocate for it anymore.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to follow that study and see what they're able to find. Do you think that loss of the wild mallard genes is high enough or significant enough that people are going to start, actually legislating against the wild release or the release of captive mallards? Or do you think we're still a ways away from that?
I think it depends. At a broad scale, I think that would probably be something pretty hard to do. In Illinois, for instance, we don't allow it. In order to release wild birds like that or raised birds like that, you need signed permission from the DNR director, and usually the biologists are asked their opinion on those things, and I can't think of a time when we've ever advocated for it. Some states do a pretty good job of limiting it already, whereas other states are sponsoring it, and hopefully there could be enough pressure from the results of this and from other studies to make them see that it's not in the best interest of the waterfowling community to continue doing that.
Sure.
Okay, moving on to the next question is from Tricia, and she asked, what are the major differences between diving and dabbling ducks?
Sure. There are a number of differences, both physiological as well as behavior. I guess just kind of touching the surface a little bit. One of the kind of main things is dabbling ducks have legs that are positioned more centrally on their body. That makes it easier for them to walk around on land. They typically feed by only inserting their bill or their head into the water, or if the water's a little bit deeper, they'll tip up, and kind of leg position and body shape facilitates that. They're also able to dive for one, but it's not energetically efficient. They can certainly do it, but they prefer to dabble or tip up. They also are able to, just because of their body shape and size, and wing structure and shape, are able to jump straight up off the water when taking off. They don't need to get a running start, where diving ducks, on the other hand, they need to get a running start across the water to get momentum up to take off. Their legs are positioned further back on their body that facilitates underwater swimming, kind of more like a propeller almost, rather than just paddles, I guess. They typically kind of have stubbier bodies, shorter wings, but are often really powerful. They almost always dive to feed, sometimes to crazy depths. I think like commercial fishermen in the oceans have caught some diving duck species or sea duck species, like, well below 100 feet below the surface, which is pretty wild to think about. Yeah, there's other ecological and behavioral differences too, but those are kind of the main things.
Perfect, thank you. We will move on to Ron's question. And this is kind of a timely question, because I saw that you guys just announced that you're going to postpone the blind drawings until, I think, August, if I'm correct. So Ron asks, are there any plans to revisit the blind allocation system? It seems rather unfair that some hunters are awarded a blind for several years, while some can't even draw for a single day. And he also said, thanks for doing this question and answer session.
That's a good question as well. And this is an issue that comes up with some regularity. It's kind of a contentious issue. There's kind of two camps of folks out there: those who absolutely love the blind allocation system and those who do not, I guess I would say. Those that love it, they're usually successful at obtaining a blind in most years. They have success from them. It works for them. They're set up to hunt that way. They have, the materials to build a blind and lots of decoys and whatnot. Those folks, when any discussion of the blind allocation system comes up, defend it vehemently. And I understand it. It's their tradition. It is their way of hunting. Frankly, it's my way of hunting. We hunt out of blinds a majority of the time these days. And other folks, may struggle to even draw a good blind or a reasonably good blind, even a day or two a season. And I absolutely understand the frustration in that. I don't know exactly what the best alternative or thing we could change is. I don't see the allocation system changing in any real significant way in any time soon. I think that would have to be a strong drive from the hunting community to do that. Personally, I would like to see additional opportunities at our sites as we expand management units or increase the size of our sites or neighboring sites or whatever, and try to establish some alternative hunting opportunities, I guess, whether those are walk-in opportunities or drawing daily for stakes or something along those lines that guarantee that someone who, not necessarily guarantee, but provide an opportunity for folks that weren't lucky enough to get one of the allocation blinds to allow them to still have a spot to go that has that is in well-managed habitat that has a real high opportunity to harvest some ducks on a given day. I think that would help a lot. The reality of putting that in motion is a challenge, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that we should continue to work on.
Well said.
Okay, so our next question comes from Leaf, and he asks, why do a lot of lottery blinds have to be built with tons of materials and to exact dimensions?
Sure, and this is kind of related to the previous question. So that system was established well before my time, but my understanding is that the idea is that you have private hunters build these blinds that, although they are available to the hunters that built them every day of the season or every day that they're available to hunt, the original idea would be that those hunters wouldn't be there every day. And so that on days that they're not there, those blinds would then be available to the public to come and hunt. So rather than just say, this group that is a party of two, it's a hunter and his buddy, or, father and son, or, two brothers, or whatever it might be, building a really small 2-man blind that fits their small little John boat. Well, then a party of 4 draws their blind on a day that they're not present, and there's absolutely not room for them. So kind of some standards were established so that one, a party of 4 would at least have room for all 4 hunters. You would know that it would fit a boat of such and such a size, that there would be a spot for your dog, and that all 4 guys would be able to hunt at the same time. Another issue is durability. At a lot of these sites, whether it's in the open water center of a lake or in the river channel proper, there's a lot of wear and tear on these things, and so making sure that they are built sturdily enough to withstand that entire season of beating from winds and waves and ice and everything else is really important. You can't have a group of hunters get in a blind they're not familiar with the day after a windstorm and have the bottom fall through it and someone getting hurt or something like that. So it's kind of, my understanding anyway, is that it's kind of safety, and then it's also kind of just standardized so that everybody that gets in a blind is going to know approximately what they're getting into before they climb through that door.
Sure. Now, is there an environmental component to those specifications as well, in terms of the materials that can be used and things like that?
At some sites, it's not consistent across all of our sites. There are some restrictions on what can be used in some areas. We're trying harder to make sure that folks aren't using things that are really irresponsible. For instance, using invasive species to brush blinds. We don't like to see things like shingles end up on blinds, and other various things that are just going to pollute our sites or our waterways for the purpose of providing sport. We want to try to do our best to be good stewards of the resource.
Sure. Excellent. We'll move on to our next few questions. This one kind of relates to Canada geese and Canada goose ecology. We actually have a few questions that kind of relate to the Canada goose. So Patricia asks, with the increasing resident population of Canada geese, has the early goose season been successful at managing these populations?
Sure. Early on, when September seasons were first established to kind of target what resident geese, now we refer to them as temperate breeding geese. Those seasons really don't have, at least not in Illinois, really have enough participation to what I would say to really keep that population in check. The folks that hunt September geese seem to do it every year and seem to really enjoy it. The geese are a little bit naive because there's a lot of juveniles in the population. The weather's warm, so your equipment needs are often a little bit less. You don't need all the heavy layers and clothing, so it can be a pretty good recruitment tool at that time of the year. But there's other folks that they're either still busy with work or sports or whatever else it might be in early September like that, or they don't, it's too hot, they don't want to fight the mosquitoes, whatever it might be. We don't have near as high participation in September seasons as we do in other seasons, and really it's kind of the number of hunters that kind of dictates harvest. We know that most hunters don't shoot the full limit of geese every time they go out. The average is probably I don't even know it right offhand. It's probably a half a goose to a goose a day, somewhere in that neighborhood, and so that's really not enough to bring those populations down or really even keep them in check in most areas.
Sure. Do you have you guys looked at trying to restructure something to hopefully make that impact a little more substantial on the resident population, or is it something that at this point it's not of huge concern?
Our our statewide resident population is relatively stable. We haven't seen any big jumps or spikes in a long time. You know, there's always going to be kind of hotspots where, you know, a new population kind of either moves into an area or establishes. And so we're on a kind of a slow, relatively stable to slow upward trend. You know, we haven't really seen a steady decline or a consistent decline at all. So my take is that for September goose hunting, probably the issue is probably access a lot of the time. You know, the crops are still in the field, so you don't really have a lot of fields that you'd have access to later in the season. So you know, a lot of that hunting occurs over water, and with, you know, folks just don't have access to private ponds and other places like that where geese hang out. It's at that time of the year, it's just challenging to get where the geese are. I think more folks might do it if they had better opportunities. It just doesn't lend itself well to a whole lot of people being out there at the same time, I guess.
Sure. And I think a lot of it you could probably speak a little bit more on this, but plays into, you know, where these birds are located too. A lot of what we see, you know, in the central part of the state, the big resident populations are in city centers where it's really hard to hunt, lots of no hunting areas. So I'm sure that plays into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a lot of those resident geese are in urban or suburban areas, and in September they're really not looking for you know, high carbohydrate crop residue foods yet or anything like that. They're still perfectly content feeding on green grass and in the neighborhoods and around the ponds and whatnot. And you know, so if you've got a pasture pond or something like that somewhere, you know, you can have an absolutely fantastic couple of hunts. But you know, if your only access is to fields or public property, there just isn't a ton of opportunity for those birds.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep. And that goes right into our next question. Lisa asks, what is the most effective way of lowering resident geese populations, specifically for HOAs?
Sure. One way would be to call our urban goose project manager, Ben Williams. He's based out of our Bartlett office. This is kind of his day job. He deals with these things day in and day out. We can provide contact information for him. But Ben will have some great recommendations for what can be done and staying legal and everything. But in general, there's a fair number of tools available. This is one place where if you're in a location where hunting can be done safely, some targeted hunting of those geese can absolutely bring those numbers down, especially in the September season, depending on where you're at. With a limit of 5 a day, you know, a handful of hunters, you know, can put a pretty big dent in those birds. That's one way for certain. Unfortunately, a lot of times with an HOA or something similar, there's really not a safe place that hunting can take place. We often will talk about habitat modification, the kind of standard urban suburban landscape that includes mowed and fertilized grass right to the edge of the pond is just exactly what those resident geese are looking for. So doing some prairie plantings or some shrub plantings or some pollinator garden plantings or something like that in a pretty good buffer around the edge of the pond can discourage goose use. They like those big open sight lines where they can see predators coming, where they can see humans approaching. So anything that provides a visual obstruction can make them a little more nervous and less likely to stay anyway. An important point to remember is that you can disturb geese up until they start to nest. So if you have geese starting to settle on your pond or lake or whatever it might be in the spring, early in the spring, you can aggressively disturb them away from that area. And if they have used that area before, it's going to be a challenge. But, you know, get a hold of us and we can talk about ways to do that effectively. But if you can get them to leave before they establish nesting, that's a great thing. One other big issue is feeding. you know, you can put up all the signs you want in the world, but unless you really crack down on people feeding and make sure that everybody understands that it's a problem, you know, one person walking by and tossing a couple slices of bread can undo all of the other work that's been done, you know, to dissuade geese to stay out of there. That it desensitizes them to humans, and it just really encourages them and reinforces them that that's a place they want to be. So you absolutely have to be really strong about stopping feeding if that's taking place. There's various other things as well. You know, you can use decoys and lasers and chemical repellents and various things. They usually habituate to that stuff. Those aren't terribly effective. Taking things a step further, there's some permitted activities where we'll use oiling to make the eggs no longer viable so that they don't hatch. That's not something that reduces the population, but it's going to prevent population growth. That's an important step. And then there's some further steps that you can take down the line where we do actual removals, where the geese are rounded up and processed into food for consumption and distributed to food banks. But that's a really extensive process. And we set a significant number of hoops that have to be navigated by a group before we consider permitting that, and that cost also is put onto that group. It's not an insignificant thing at all, and frankly, we would like to see other avenues used prior to that point. It's really a last case scenario.
Sure, perfect. We'll move on to our next question from Tito. What is the greatest current threat to waterfowl populations?
Sure, that's a really good question as well. There's all kinds of stuff, but the first thing that always jumps in my mind is habitat. We know that waterfowl populations, ducks in particular, are largely driven by breeding season habitat, so grasslands to nest in, pair ponds to establish pair bonds and territories on prior to nesting, cover for broods, you know, so additional wetlands, and the majority of our ducks in Illinois and really in the continent come from the Prairie Pothole region. So primarily Saskatchewan, Manitoba, a little bit Alberta, North Dakota, South Dakota, a little bit Minnesota. Those areas are the critical area where we need grass on the landscape, and we need as many wetlands as we can have on the landscape. As we lose, you know, grassland acres and we lose wetland acres as they're converted to other things or drained away or whatever it may be, every, you know, in there's places there where you can have 60 nesting ducks in a really small area, you know, 100 ducks per square mile or things like that, really high densities, and so we need to really protect those key areas. That's, you know, that's going to be the key to providing a large number of ducks from a continental scale. Regionally or locally, I still say it's habitat as well. In Illinois specifically, we're mid-migration or wintering habitat primarily. So the things that ducks need are areas to feed and areas to rest where they're unmolested. So we need effective refuge habitat that is providing high quality food sources, and we just need a fair amount of food on the landscape in general. In Illinois, you know, we've lost over 90% of our original wetlands in Illinois. We plant about 11 million acres of corn annually. I struggle to say that we need more agricultural crops to feed ducks, but what we are really lacking is shallow wetland habitat. You know, we've lost an awful lot of shallow marsh. We've lost an awful lot of, you know, what I'd consider moist soil habitat, so annual plants that produce a lot of seeds. Those are the habitat types that are really limiting, and the habitat types that are probably used most commonly by a variety of different duck species. We have, you know, our remaining wetlands. We have a lot of open water. That's okay for resting. It's hard to feed in open water, depending on the depth. Diving ducks may be able to do it effectively, but dabbling ducks struggle. So yeah, habitat is really the critical component in both directions for migration as well. When ducks are heading north for spring migration, we need to make sure that we need to make sure that our wetlands are still wet. As those ducks head north, we know that hens that are in better condition nest earlier, and earlier nesting hens have more success than later nesting hens. So making sure that those birds arrive on the breeding grounds in good condition is a really important part of the whole picture. That's assuming that the breeding grounds have sufficient habitat to support nesting birds.
Sure. Now you mentioned that, particularly in the prairie pothole region, that habitat conversion to other land use is a huge concern. Has climate change impacted any of those, the vegetation structure, the density, or even kind of the species that are present there?
It's been a few years since I've done a whole lot of prairie habitat work or spent much time out there. I think the issue that I'm probably most aware of is going to be related to precipitation. As precipitation patterns change, the number of snowpack has a big impact on it. So how much snow is on the landscape kind of at the end of winter that's going to melt quickly and run off and fill those small basin wetlands, and then how many precipitation events you're going to get after that that's going to keep those basins full or make sure that the other bigger marshes that are going to be brood wetlands remain full, or making sure that it's not too much precipitation and that those slightly larger wetlands don't grow to the size of lakes and lose that important emergent vegetation component and whatnot. So I guess I'm not so sure as far as vegetation communities shifting as much as those precipitation patterns. I guess one thing would be that as things continually warm, we see different crops planted further and further north. So we used to see very little corn in South Dakota and North Dakota and even into Canada, and there's corn in all of those places now. And that's a big change. And so things like winter wheat or other winter varieties of small grains can be important nesting cover, especially for early nesting species like pintails. And as we see those crops become less common and converted to things like corn and beans, they're no longer useful at all for duck nesting or for duck habitat at all. So it's kind of death by a million cuts, I guess. But yeah, there's certainly changes.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, this next question comes from Daniel, and his question is, why is non-toxic shot required for waterfowl when most fishing sinkers are still depositing lead into the water?
Sure, that's a good consideration. So I think the issue there would be scale. So with a shotgun shell, you're depositing, I guess it's been a while since I've cut a shotgun shell open and counted the number of pellets, but let's say 100 just for the sake of discussion, 100 pellets at a time. Whereas, and let's say you've got a blind full of guys and everybody shoots a handful of times. You're talking about thousands of pellets distributed in a single day over the course of a couple of hours. And generally, if you're hunting all from the same location and shooting in the same direction, you've got a pretty dense number of pellets in that one spot. Now you consider a long time established blind, and where hundreds of shots a season or thousands of shots a season have been fired out of it, you've got a really high density of lead pellets or any pellets for that matter in a pretty finite area in front of that blind. Fishing, on the other hand, you're certainly losing tackle from time to time, but it is typically one sinker at a time here and there. It's you're very rarely losing 100 sinkers in a day, or many hundreds of sinkers in a day, or thousands of sinkers in a day. There's certainly evidence of lead poisoning from sinkers on real heavily fished lakes, particularly in northern states like Minnesota, where fishing is, very, very popular. But I think the main concern from lead is not necessarily leaching into the environment, but it's actually ingestion by waterfowl or other wetland birds. A couple of pellets ingested by a duck can lead to lead poisoning, and you might think it's got to be impossible for a duck to find a pellet in the mucky bottom of a typical wetland. My master's work, I looked at diets of spring migrating mallards and lesser scaup, and one of my study sites was on a heavily hunted DNR site, and I'd have to go back and look at my numbers. I kept some notes on it, but it was probably about 25% of the mallards taken on that site in the spring for my study had pellets in their gizzards. So so it had been months since anyone had fired a pellet over that site, and yet ducks were still picking them up off the bottom. I don't know if they think that they're a seed or a small snail, or if they think it's grit or whatever it is. But I was absolutely shocked at how common it was to cut open a gizzard and to find steel shot in there. So if that was a lead shot, each of those birds probably would have succumbed to lead poisoning. And once you extrapolate that to all the hunted areas, across the landscape, and all the ducks that are using those areas during the non-hunting season, it can be a really significant factor. So it's really just a matter of scale, I think. I think there's probably, lead bans on fishing tackle being considered in places. There's probably some already in place. But it certainly doesn't seem to be at the scale that shotgun pellets would be.
Sure. Well, that was our last question. So a huge thank you to Randy Smith for joining us today and answering a few questions. Do you have anything else you want to add? Maybe a few upcoming projects that you've kind of got in the pipeline or things like that? If not, we can cut this out.
Sure. I'm trying to think what we've got going on here. We're still working on the next 5-year set of waterfowl hunting regulations for the 2021 through 2025 season. We're working with the director's office and various other entities to figure out how to best navigate finalizing that. We always have a lot of research and whatnot going on. I'm just continually hopeful that we can continue to expand waterfowl hunting opportunities. And, in some areas, I think we need to focus on simply providing opportunities. And in other areas, we need to focus on providing higher quality opportunities. And it's a different target depending on the location. But it's something that we talk about every day and constantly trying to work on to make the sport better for everybody that participates in it.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to seeing some of those changes implemented. And again, thanks for joining us today. And to all those watching at home, thanks. And